It's crucial, to share this responsibility with the developers, because at the end, as you said, what matters is that the end user is happy and they can use the product. The business is what matters most. And the developers are the one that empower the application. So they are the people that knows the tricky part of the code base. You have to think about, is this feature or this piece of code observable? So can I figure it out from the outside what's going on? So code review here plays a big role.
Hi, I'm Liz Fong-jones.
And I'm Shelby Spees.
And you're listening to Observability Cast, or o11ycast for short, a fortnightly series about the art and science of making production systems observable, easy to maintain, and appropriately reliable.
o11ycast is brought to you by Heavybit, a program dedicated to helping startups take their developer products to market. For more information, visit heavybit.com. If you're interested in being a guest on this show, or if you have a specific topic you'd like us to dive into, you can reach us on Twitter at o11ycast.
I think it's really a deep strategic choice. When you start, it's easy to, just install an open source software and try to hack around it. But at some point, even more when you do like monitoring, you have to monitor and take care of your monitoring system. So you kind of go deep on a loop that is not easy to escape from. It's a lot the same topic we do with hardware at Equinix Method. Like when do you go to cloud? When do you buy your own hardware? So it's a never-ending question. I think it really depends on how do you want to approach the problem. It is strategic for you to solve it by yourself because you want to do more with the solution, or you are just looking for the end solution and you want it reliable and you want to blame somebody when it doesn't work. So I think that's mainly how do I try to decide when I have to?
So it sounds like you're alluding to almost a question of how much do you need to customize it versus how much does the off-the-shelf thing work for you?
Yeah, I think it's definitely one point. I mean, if you want to invest if you think that it's a great idea to be able to have your end solution as you want it, because it is good for your team, it's good for your product, you definitely need the ability to hack the code around the product. But if you just want something that works and you can take the trade-off of making your workflow good enough to work with the solution you are buying is good enough.
So what are some of those kind of tipping points for you? What are kind of the signs that you're outgrowing something?
Yeah, I mean, I think at some point you definitely need to question about why the requests that you receive are the one you get. So why, if you have a problem with your monitoring system because it's growing too fast and your team keeps asking you to add more storage or more hardware, is that a reasonable answer to just add more SSDs or more object store, more capacity, or you have to figure out a different solution for that? And maybe the solution is to stop and just look at the metrics that you are sending and figuring out why they come so heavily, because maybe it's a bug. So sometimes you have to stop, even if you buy or if you don't, you just have to stop and look at the context you are in, trying to figure out if it's reasonable for your scale, for your project, for your team or not. Because if it gets too heavy, it becomes really hard to understand because the noise grows so much that it becomes almost useless because you're always looking at signals that are not clear anymore. You lose trust on your system, and it will be very frustrating for a team. And I've been there. I've been to a team where we had a single alerts channel on Slack that was always on fire. And at some point, I just mute all of them and nobody cares anymore. And still, sometimes I get requirements maybe from different stakeholders that are not developers, and maybe just they use Slack in a different way, or they use the Jira in a different way, and they want to know what's going on from their perspective. So they ask me, okay, can you set up a Slack channel for all the notification? The answer is always you're gonna get so much noise that you won't look at them anymore. But I learned that it really depends on the stakeholders sometimes. So you have to stop and just trying to figure out who is the person that's asking what and if it's reasonable.
So now would be a great time for you to introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Gianluca. I'm from Italy, and I'm from Turin, so from the Alps, really close to the Alps. So I'm a bit sad that this year I won't be able to ski, at least at the beginning of the year. But I'm a software engineer, so I started as a developer, and I moved to ops when I learned how many things I was able to do with a few API requests. And now that I learned that, I started a new journey at Equinix Metal, and I work on hardware and data center because I was a bit sad of not knowing a lot of technologies that were behind those API requests. So now I'm increasing my visibility on the stack that I know. And yeah, I am an open source enthusiast and contributor. So I help projects like Kubernetes or Docker or test containers, mainly Go libraries or Go projects, growing or fixing bugs and trying to keep up with the community. For me, it's a good way to learn when I have the possibility to contribute to a project. So that's mainly me.
That's so much good stuff. And I like how you started, as a developer, and you've just sort of gone deeper and deeper down the stack. So can you talk more about like what you work on the hardware side at Equinix?
Yeah, as I said, it's completely a new field. I mean, for me, like I started my career as a developer like 8 years ago, and Amazon was already big and there. So cloud providers for me are the way to go when it comes to provisioning software. So at some point, I had the opportunity to start to look at this problem in a different way. And currently I'm working at Tinkerbell. That is a project that we use internally to provision our data centers in a handless way, so without having to touch them all the time. So I have to say, I discovered that there are no people running a data center with USB sticks and install the operating system. So I thought it was that the case, but it's all automatic. So it's different.
And Tinkerbell is open source, right? I think I was on a live stream with Amy Toby working on the Tinkerbell source code a couple of months ago.
Yeah, it's open source, and we recently joined the CNCF as a sandbox project. And yeah, I'm very excited for that because to me, it looks like the missing layer in the CNCF landscape. We have a lot of tools that we can use to build monitoring solution or identity and authorization access or orchestrator, but managing hardware in the cloud landscape is something that wasn't that clear.
Right, exactly, because a lot of people have been using public cloud providers, but for people that want to roll their own private cloud, there hasn't been a CNCF project to handle the hardware wrangling. That's really exciting.
Yeah, that's what we do. And there is a lot to learn for me, so I share a lot on Twitter. So my journey is there, learning in public, let's say.
Yeah, and we'll be sure to put a link to your Twitter bio in the show notes.
So I'm curious how you got so interested in observability from like a hardware perspective, like connect those dots for us.
I mean, yeah, I definitely missed a big chunk of my career during my presentation because before joining Equinix Metal, I used to work for InfluxDB. That is a company that developed a time series database. And that's where I learned way more about what it means, like monitoring a system, or what it means to treat time series databases as a first citizen in a stack. So that's where I learned all the stuff that we will probably talk today. But to tell you about the bridge between observability and hardware, I think something really good that we do at Equinix is like the logistic, like build quickly data centers and finding hardwares and knowing where it is, where it's hooked, all the switches and the cables, all those stuff in my mind pictures as a trace, because you have to slice and dice and see where the packet is going, or all the interconnection between the servers, and a lot of those end up as a trace. So I keep that in mind, even if I'm not in the time series.
Yeah, I remember the first time that I and other teammates who were at Google Cloud started looking at data center provisioning and data center turnup and visualizing those as traces. It was a very eye-opening moment of, wait a second, it's taking 3 months to do what?
Yeah, the trace gets very long.
Yeah, it was really cool to see this firsthand when Liz, you were starting to roll out Graviton 2 for us, and Amazon actually ran out of capacity of the Graviton 2 instances. And so it's like, this is something I've never thought about before because this is the first time I've been on a team where we're using like bleeding edge hardware. And so like that back and forth conversation with the Amazon support to just like make sure we got the hardware we needed to scale up in time was really cool, and something that maybe like the average team doesn't have to think about. But when hardware is it's a bottleneck for you, that's really important to be able to think about.
Yeah, it's all real physical processes.
Mm-hmm. And there's somebody at the other end like plugging in wires and slinging servers on racks. So it's very exciting to get visibility into that.
Yeah.
So you mentioned your earlier work at InfluxDB. Kind of how much performance engineering and tuning were you doing? Like how are you measuring the results of your software engineering on InfluxDB?
Yeah, I mean, I joined as a SRE when we started to consolidate the current SaaS offer we had. So let's call it version 1. And after a few months, we started to plan the version 2. This is the one that is currently running today. And we also had the opportunity to heavily be the user of our project. That is not something, that obvious when you start a new SaaS, because you are scared about all the new unknown that you will discover. So the way we monitor the system was with InfluxDB itself. So we deliver a bunch of InfluxDBs that were our monitoring system, and we had like agents running on all the servers that were mainly monitoring the amount of points that every customer were sending and the amount of reads. The data point was the unit of working there more than like CPUs and memory.
Right, exactly, right? Like it's about the critical business metrics and the critical user journeys, right? Like that's what matters and not necessarily, as you were saying, CPU utilization. That's really cool. And also kind of like who watches the watchers, right? Like who observes your observability system?
That's definitely something we learned the hard way. I mean, at the beginning, we were relying way more on logs. I remember when I joined, we were using paper trails. It's like a lot more a traditional way of doing monitoring, even if we were the one writing the new age of monitoring back then. But yeah, as soon as we did the transition, with my background as a developer and not as an operation person, I kind of saw the struggling of my colleagues trying to make the application speaking a language that was understandable. And it was a pleasure to see that transition happening in my teammates and myself.
What you said just now, the speaking a language that's like understandable, it reminds me of what our Honeycomb CEO, Christine, was talking about in a talk she just gave at GitHub Universe about like observability for developers and teaching production in the language of developers, right? Like Liz said, it's not just speaking CPU utilization and memory pressure and things like that. It's talking like this is where in your code that's being affected and where you can like answer those where questions. And so I think there's a lot of value there. We're trying to do a better job of like helping people understand like observability is for developers and it helps everybody to teach prod the language of your business logic.
Yeah, I think it's crucial, to share this responsibility with the developers, because at the end, as you said, what matters is that the end user is happy and they can use the product. And usually CPU, memory, disk are like, collateral requirements that makes this journey enjoyable. But, the business is what matters most. And the developers are the one that empower the application to run in some way. So they are the people that knows, the tricky part of the code base and how it really speaks. I spoke at conferences, and my title for my talk often was like teaching to your application how to speak, because this is what I think a developer should do. It's just, you have to think about, is this feature or this piece of code observable? So can I figure it out from the outside what's going on? So code review here plays a big role.
Mm-hmm.
So when did you start getting introduced to this concept of observability, right, as distinct from monitoring?
Yeah.
Because I think you're kind of getting there now.
I mean, I can hide myself behind my fingers. It's coming from like, I met Charity Measure a couple of times during conferences, and I started to follow the journey of the Scuba paper back then, and the rise of Honeycomb definitely helped me to, consolidate and place some good word explaining what I had in my mind and what I was seeing around myself. So it's Honeycomb played a good role on my. I think as I always like to say when I read books about like how to develop or like architecture layout, is like when you read good authors like writing, they, even if the topics are something that you may see around already, the way they describe it makes it more clear or more solid in your mind. And I think that was important.
Right, exactly. Like something finally starts clicking, right?
Yeah. You are hands-on, like deep with your head in the problem, and you just, see that there is a pattern, but you can clearly see it until somebody tells you in a good way that that's what you're doing. So it was a good time when I started reading about observability.
Yeah, and that's exactly why, like, I appreciate having people like you going and being part of the observability community and like sharing this stuff, because like as much as Liz and Charity and I talk about this, like the way we say things isn't going to click for everybody, right? Like the more people who talk about observability in different ways and help promote this stuff, like the better it is for like our entire like tech community. And that's what we're in it for, right? Is like we're just trying to make everyone's like jobs a little bit easier and help us like build better systems. And so like I love when I see people go out and give talks and post on Twitter and write blog posts about this stuff, because it helps everyone to have just more voices in the mix.
And speaking of blog posts, like we really enjoyed your blog post about kind of instrumenting with varying solutions and piping the data to varying places and seeing how it turned out.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very important for the ecosystem to be a real ecosystem. I mean, we need people, because metrics come from everywhere in every form, and they go everywhere in different forms. So it's nobody can hold them forever. So it's kind of important to build a system that can exchange the information in a common layer. And the work like you are doing with Open Telemetry is like very good. And it kind of took me a while to handle that, because I was coming from, open tracing before, open census, and, the merge kind of made at the beginning, the ecosystem a bit struggling, because, transition is never easy, even less when the tools that you treat have a life cycle of 2 years or whatever. But yeah, I think that, I can clearly see the end goal, and I can't wait to be there when, all the system that we install, if they come from open source or from closed source, like who cares? They will speak the same language. We'll be able to understand them, not as a black box anymore, if developers do a good job of, instrumenting their tool.
So let's talk about that. What does it mean for developers to do a good job instrumenting?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, as I say, I think collaboration and code review is for sure something that has to be built in the culture of a team. And if code review is already built, make sure that, looking at how a feature in a code is written and debuggable and observable is another checkpoint that you have to add in your list of important stuff we have to review during a code review session. So that's definitely one. Another is reading logs. Like if you write logs, if you write trace, use them. It's not the time anymore to write print line random lines in standard output and forget about them. They have traction. They have they need to share context, to build context. So you need to be sure that those lines are in the right place, in the right format, telling the right stuff. So you have to use them no matter, like, not waiting for an outage, not waiting for like latency to spike to look at them. Otherwise you won't be able to really figure out if it's you or the system.
Yeah, like being proactive and actually like, interacting with the telemetry that you're generating, making sure that the stuff you're sending is meaningful and accurate. And I think it aligns a lot with like how we teach, testing is like, you don't want to just write meaningless tests just to get the check mark on the test coverage report. Like you want to write tests that actually test what your code is doing and like all the cases that you care about. And so it's the same thing for instrumentation is like, you don't want to just like spew out junk that you're never going to look at. And I think a lot of teams, that's exactly what they have is just, the log stream and whatever. And so this is where like, having tools and having data that's like structured and meaningful encourages people to actually interact with it. It makes a better experience.
Yeah, it's this idea of observability-driven development and this idea of not treating your logs as a write-only data source.
Yeah.
One question I had for you, Gianluca, is so InfluxDB had both a SaaS offering and a pure open source offering. What were some of the major differences that you encountered when you were trying to adapt the open source offering into being a multi-tenant SaaS solution?
Yeah, I think the big challenge is the entropy that more users create on the system. So the fact that you are not looking at a single box anymore that you can figure out in its pattern, but it's like a mess coming from all over and kind of trying to step over each other. So that's definitely it's completely different signal. And in the first version of the SaaS we developed, every customer had its own little cluster. And that was very consuming in terms of resources, because you had your 5, 6, 7, 10 ACQs for every customer with load balancer and whatever. So in terms of resources, was a huge waste. But obviously, you treat every customer and all the signals as a single one, and you know that it's coming and there is no noise. Let's say it's almost like it's way easier to figure out what's going on because it's one customer doing their own stuff. If something changes drastically, it's even a bug, or they change their model and you have to figure out if it's reasonable or legit or not. When you start to mix customers and patterns all together, you need a different dimension. So usually you have to architecture your code in a way that can represent that dimension. So typically it's the user dimension or the API token dimension. So the troublemaker is the API token, not even the user.
Right, which starts getting to the idea of high cardinality.
Yeah, that's where it plays. And when you with tracing, as you pointed out, you get to even more cardinality issue, because you have the smallest dimension you can get, like the single request. That is what really at the end all want. So yeah, and this is definitely, the change in signal, even if the product was the same, was definitely challenging, because InfluxDB was the same. The people were still writing and reading points, but as soon as we started to mix them together in a tenant fashion, the signals as we knew them didn't have much sense anymore. So we had to figure out that new dimension, the user or the API token. Yeah. To get back to the previous question, because I think it's nice. It was nice. What I think developers should do is also learning about how to architect an application in a way that is, for example, traceable. How can you write an application that it's easy to trace? How do you do that? So I recently, not that recently anymore, I think it was 2 years ago. It's ages in computing. And I learned about reactive planning and how you can do control loops, almost like the Kubernetes architecture, but much simpler than the old Kubernetes. And that pattern is also very easy to trace, because you have an executor that is a central one that takes plan steps and actions and executes them. And having a single place for the execution of the logic is a very good strategy, because when you have to add trace, you just go to the executor part and you add the code there. And for me was when I first instrumented a custom orchestrator we had at Influx when I joined, we saw that all the AWS requests that were happening, and Amazon has very good limits in terms of how many requests you can throw and fire. So we never really experienced problems. And also when you develop application like an orchestrator, that they have to be safe and controllable, but being fast is not really the priority there. You add maybe a new request over here, another one over there, and over time you get to 150 requests for each provisioning. Mm-hmm. And that times at some point gets back and you need to figure it out. And for us, it was very easy to figure out all of those, because we had a single place for the execution of the code. And we also used the AWS SDK that, luckily for us, had a good hook for pre and post execution of our requests. So we just hooked the tracing in there, and magically we had visibility on all the system. So having this kind of configuration in mind when you architect a code makes all the difference, because if it gets too hard, you won't do it.
Totally. And I think it's a similar way that, both the design at the individual repository level, and then also the bigger architecture level, thinking about what makes things traceable, what makes things modular, what makes things where the context is like easy to promote and send out to your observability tool it's really important. And it helps you write better code. It helps you build better systems. And then also in the process, like this example, I love this example because it's like, no, there's no one thing that is a really obvious cause of like latency or whatever. It's just like growing and growing over time. But when you have good tracing, that answers the where question. Like, where do we start to optimize this? And that's a really hard question to answer if you don't have that visibility. So all of these things, all of these goals like tie into each other. And so that's like it's worth it. It's worth the effort.
And also good DevX and good ergonomics can really help in terms of having, one place to hook in traces or one place to automatically instrument your API calls, where that really makes the difference to having effective observability rather than saying, we have, this many signals or this many tools, instead talking about that developer experience.
Yeah. And I really think we should keep saying that, but it's a developer responsibility to, having all those dots in line. Because definitely operation may benefit from it, but it's really a developer effort. And I think it's also useful to, build a reinforcing loop around like tracing and stuff like that. Like if you, like cloud providers, I keep saying Amazon because I know them, but I'm sure others does that as well. You get a request ID back as a developer from the API. And if you tell that request ID to the support team, they will be able to, look at your specific request that is failing. And usually the problem will be yourself. So it's never an AWS fault. It's always your fault. But it's a very good, it's a reinforcing loop that you should have in your mind. If you're doing tracing, share your trace ID with your customer. And if your customers are not developer, find a way to sneak the trace ID in their UI and in their user experience, in their journey, and build a loop for that. And we made a very interesting stuff at Influx back then when we shared part of our internal metrics with our customer. So every customer had like a co-monitor. So it was a dashboard in their chronograph. And in this way, we kind of shared the pain, operating their solution. And as a side effect, we had a lot less requests from support because they were able to figure out their problem by themselves. So if they were delivering, like sometimes it's very hard to figure out how much you are spamming with your application because you maybe had a new for loop with a log in there, and from there stuff gets crazy. So it's way easier to demand to the destination of your monitoring system, to know what's going on. So we had customers that were delivering a new, maybe like the version 2 of their application. So they weren't really sure about what was going on. And the amount of logs or the amount of noise that were generating was the best metrics they had at that time.
Yeah, it's definitely really, really critical to have people share that same view between different teams or between customers and a service provider. That's really how you get ahead of problems rather than have people complaining afterwards.
And it's something I'm really excited about, that we're starting to see AWS involvement in OpenTelemetry. And Jana Dogan talks about, Liz, you and Jana were on an event the other week, and you were talking about just that provider observability is something that Charity's talked about a lot too, whereas when you're building a platform and people make a request and they don't realize it's the most inefficient, way to write that query ever. And so they're thrashing your system. And so just having a little bit more visibility into that, the provider, the platform, offering that visibility helps both sides, right? It helps the client debug their stuff, and it helps the provider help the client debug their stuff. And so even if we're all, we're on the buy side more often than the build side, we can still be a shared team with the services that we buy and the people who run those. And it's something that we do at Honeycomb is, when someone has they're really struggling, we've gone and helped them debug their instrumentation and stuff. And so I think that relationship is going to just continue being really, really important. And observability, shared observability, can help with that.
Yeah, you build trust, and that's important in a monitoring system. So.
So as we reach the end of our time, Gianluca, I wanted to ask one question that I don't think we've asked very many other guests, because like most of our guests have been from the kind of native English-speaking world. What's it been like for you kind of developing the SRE practices and developing the observability practices in the Italian community?
I have a fun story. So a few years ago, like maybe like 6, 7, I was working in a company in Italy, and I had colleagues that were, I use this example because it's very fun. Like we were all together watching tailing logs from a couple of servers, and the speed of the logs of the tail were, the argument for how good or bad an application were working. If the logs were too fast, we were under pressure, so the application wasn't working well enough. If they were not enough, maybe we weren't getting enough requests, what was broken. So that was our monitoring system back then. And it works. It's definitely, the sharing experience we spoke just a few minutes ago wasn't really great, because if the person who had the knowledge about the pattern of the logs was leaving or was on holiday, that was a really painful situation. So it's been a long journey since then. But I organized a meetup in my city, that is the CNCF one. It's good to speak about those topics, and I think the people I know from the Italian community are really pragmatic, so they want to see the difference between their current approach, even if they know that it's not the best one, but it works for them and maybe it's good enough. So you have to show them what are you speaking about and how it changed your way of developing and understanding a system. And with tracing, for example, it is very easy. Like you start to inject the library and you trace a bunch of controllers or API requests, and you can show the difference in the approach, and this helps a lot. So from my experience, that was a great way to start speaking about observability. And that's probably because I'm a developer, so for me it's easier to open the code base and dig into that. But having the opportunity to look at their issue in the code and tell them, okay, try to put a trace there, or try to change this log and try to, make it more verbose, or verbose in the right way, let's say. And so those small stuff had a huge impact for me.
Yeah, I can definitely imagine that if this is the first time that you're seeing a case study or a demonstration of value from someone in your community who speaks your language, that it can be really, really powerful.
Yeah, no, that's true. We need KubeCon, we need SRECon, all those, to learn how stuff should be done. But at some point, we need a few layers of translation to get to, where sometimes the strugglers are.
Well, thank you for all your awesome advocacy work in the community. You're a prolific blogger, and you're involved in all these projects and organizing a meetup. It's really, really cool to see all of that. So thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And it's easy to write stuff or share what I do for me, because it's a way for learn and double check that I'm doing something that is useful. But it's also good to hear that it's going well and people are enjoying my work or the outcome of my struggle. So thank you for that.
Yeah, we appreciate it very much. Thank you. That was a delightful conversation that I enjoyed, and I hope you did too. If you're interested in being a guest on the show, or if you have a specific topic you'd like us to dive into, you can reach us on Twitter @o11ycast.
To learn more about Heavybit, visit heavybit.com. And while you're there, check out their library. It's packed with amazing talks on sales, marketing, product, and general management from founders of developer tools companies and other industry leaders. Hope to see you next time.